Good morning, everybody. My name is Andrea Aldana. I'm the Director of Housing Advocacy at the Community Development Partnership, and this is our latest training as part of the Lower Cape Housing Institute. Today, we are bringing you a training on Affordable Housing Trust and the Community Preservation Act, very much developed in partnership with Massachusetts Housing Partnership, who we do a lot of our offerings with. Our main speaker today is Shelley Gehring, and we also have Stuart from the Community Preservation Coalition that will be talking to you all. And then we have a fun little sort of case study from Orleans that I'm really excited to see come up. I just wanted to let you all know before I hand it over to Shelley that we do have one more training left in this fiscal year's Lower Cape Housing Institute. It's by invitation only. It's a training I've been doing pretty much annually, and it's called a housing coordinator training. It changes every year, but it's specifically for town staff who are engaged in housing work. And so if you think that that is you, or if you know someone who you think should be at that training, please get in touch with me, because we make sure that we're covering topics pertinent to the people who are participating, and we want to gather that information. But that's coming up next month. And then also, there's a few faces here who I have not seen before. Once you are a participant in one of our Housing Institute trainings like this one, you are added to our monthly Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership e-newsletter, which gives a really nice rundown every month of updates around housing in the Lower Cape region. So look out for that. And then you're also welcome to join us at our quarterly peer group meetings, which we offer for the Lower and Outer Cape. We just had our spring meetings this week, and then our next meetings are going to be the end of June. June 22nd is one of them, and I don't remember if that's Lower or Outer, but all of these links will be included in the follow-up materials for today. You are all muted, so when we get to the Q&A portion, please use the Zoom raise your hand feature. There's more people than I can see on one screen, so if you just physically raise your hand, I might not see you. So please use the Zoom raise your hand feature, or you can put your question in the chat and we will make sure to get to you. All right, all yours, Shelley. Thanks for being here.
Great, thanks. So I'm gonna share my slides, my screen. Actually, it looks like that maybe I'm not allowed to. Can someone set that up for me? So while waiting for that, many of you have heard me at some of these trainings before. I'm Shelley Gehring with MHP, Mass Housing Partnership. And today we're gonna really talk about when we have different housing entities as well as a CPC in our community, how do we facilitate those relationships? Let's see if I can. Okay, are you able to see that screen? Okay, great. So just quickly, and I know that a lot of you know of MHP, but just for those who may be newer to us, we are a quasi-state agency in Massachusetts. We are focused on the whole state and really fundamentally about just increasing the supply of affordable housing across the state. And we have 4 kind of legs to our stool. Community assistance is the team that I'm a part of. We provide a lot of technical assistance on the community level, as well as with nonprofits and housing authorities. We lend to create affordable housing, as well as to preserve housing, affordable housing. We have the One Mortgage product, the most affordable mortgage product for households earning up to 100% of the area median income in the state. And then the Center for Housing Data. So we have a team of folks that are collecting, analyzing, and sharing data to help inform our housing policy on the local, regional, and state levels. So today we're gonna look a little bit at, we are looking most specifically at affordable housing trusts and community preservation committees. But really there can be challenges with just having multiple housing entities in a community. So it's the way that what we're going to be talking about is conducive not just to trusts and CPCs, even though that's what we're primarily focusing on. So we'll look a little bit at some suggestions for collaboration. We'll look at models for CPA funding of housing trusts. We'll talk a little bit then looking at Orleans of relationships between existing housing entities. or when you create a new entity like an affordable housing trust. And we'll touch a little bit on regional collaboration, where Stuart and Liz Rust will be joining us for that section. So if I don't know if I guess did Andrea, did you say this? If people have like clarifying questions, I think put those in the chat, and then Andrea or Belinda can bring those forward, can kind of interrupt us. Otherwise, we'll have a Q&A at the end. So first, kind of looking at collaborations. So some of you may have been in a training that we did, MHP did back in December. So some of this may look familiar, but what this means is that our work shouldn't be in a vacuum. So one key thing I think is that when there's a housing entity like an affordable housing trust or an affordable housing partnership doing work on affordable housing, looking at the local needs, this may not include the CPC or members of the CPC. You know, many members of the CPC are not housing people. In fact, oftentimes there's only one person that's explicitly a housing person. You don't want the CPC to learn about the housing needs in the community in an application for funding. So the suggestion is to make sure that that the conversation is open, that the members of the housing trust or your other housing entities are openly talking about the needs, that when there's a update of your housing production plan, or if you're doing a housing needs analysis, that the CPC be invited to this. That when a report is completed, that the housing entities agree on kind of some of the key findings in your report, and that you're just repeating these all the time to different boards, so that when you are applying to the CPC, the needs that you're identifying, the kind of actions or programs that you're wanting to support, that they're not a surprise for members of the CPC, that it's known in the community. Two, the CPA statute explicitly allows for CPA funds to be transferred to the Affordable Housing Trust. So there's not a question of can that happen? It is in the statute, it's allowed. And different communities do this in different ways. So some communities, some CPCs, community preservation committees, require the housing trust to apply for a specific program or project. So to outline that in the application, like any other application or applicant. Some allow the housing trust to apply for no specific purpose, but just ask for a certain amount of funds. And then others automatically or pretty automatically transfer a set amount, a percentage every year. So there are different models based on the community, and I think relationships between boards and expectations. In some communities, like Cambridge, they're transferring actually 80% of their CPA funds directly to their affordable housing trust. So they really see their housing trust as the community housing arm of their CPC. And of course, as we know, housing in Cambridge is incredibly expensive. The crisis is very intense. And their housing folks have been very organized and present when they have their annual hearing, showing up to really advocate for this amount of funding for housing. This is the only community that I think any of us know of that has done it at this level. But Somerville has been transferring about 45% of their CPA funds to their housing trust. So they haven't been around quite as long as Cambridge, but they're also primarily seeing their housing trust as their community housing arm of their CPC, although I think that a developer could potentially go to both entities in Somerville at this point. And then some towns like Grafton tend to transfer about 10%, the 10% required for housing, the minimum amount, to their housing trust each year. So where these processes aren't where it's requiring an application, but where it's a part of that the CPC just makes these recommendations to the legislative body. All of us tend to, Stuart talks about grant agreements all the time. MHP, we talk about grant agreements all the time. So part of having a good working relationship is how in some communities they think having a fence makes better neighbors or good neighbors. It's the same kind of idea where you want to make sure that whether it's the CPC allocating resources to the trust, or whether the trust is allocating those resources beyond the trust to other to applicants, that you always want to have a grant agreement. You're using public resources, and it's this grant agreement where you can outlines some of the expected relationship between the two entities. Really think through some of the critical elements up front. So how will your boards work together? And really clarify this, clarify expectations of what does the CPC need from the housing trust? What would be helpful for the housing trust to have from the CPC? And one thing that does come up sometimes is, can CPA funds pay for administrative costs of the trust? Like, try to anticipate some of these questions beforehand, because we're oftentimes seeing them come up after money has already been transferred to the trust. And if your grant agreement doesn't have any parameters or requirements, then once the funds are with the trust, then it's difficult for the CPC to modify the expectations around those funds. So try to anticipate things up front and be really open about that, and put expectations in the grant agreement so that everyone is on the same page. And you likely know that it is now legally required in the Affordable Housing Trust statute that the trust must be reporting back to the CPC on an annual basis about how they're spending CPA funds. So the trust needs to be tracking their CPA funds separately and making an annual report to the CPC. Every CPC needs to be filing a CP3 report with the Department of Revenue every September 15th, and your ability to receive the state match hinges on whether this report has been filed. So it's important that there be communication between the CPC and the trust about when the CPC needs the trust report in order to be able to then turn around and include that information in the CP3 report to the state. What you see on the right-hand side is a screenshot of a fillable form that MHP has developed in relationship with, or in partnership with, the Community Preservation Coalition. So we're asking all of the questions that are on the CP3 report. We also have a set of directions about how to fill this form out, just like the IRS has with all of their forms, because you'd think it'd be simple, but it's not necessarily. So if the trust is filling this form out according to the directions, then it should be relatively simple for the CP3 to then include the information in their report to the state. And this report is on, this fillable form is on the Housing Toolbox underneath all of the Affordable Housing Trust information. We suggest that entities that are working on housing, that you clarify your roles up front, and that you have this conversation on a regular basis or periodically. This is just something that I've pulled from Manchester's housing production plan. And it was the way that they considered how do they provide accountability to different entities, but also explain kind of who's doing what, or outline who's doing what. So they came up with their housing strategies on the left-hand side. They determined which ones were shorter term, which ones were a little bit longer term, and then on the far right, who the lead board was in town, or the lead boards. And these entities could include a housing authority. They could include a nonprofit organization that's working on housing in your community. It could include an affordable housing committee or an affordable housing partnership. So whatever the entities are in your community, you would want to include them in this process. But this was just the way that Manchester kind of conceived and worked on determining who's doing what, so that there wasn't the stepping on toes, but also to provide some accountability to the different entities as well. And then particularly for affordable housing trusts, we talk about transparency and really encouraging communities to be very transparent with their work on their housing trust. Don't make it difficult for people in the community to understand what the trust is about, how the trust sees its role in the community, who's on the Affordable Housing Trust. I encourage to be open with your financials, although very, very few seem to be. But don't make it difficult for people to understand what you're doing, what your values are, what your priorities are. In some communities, there is a joint board appointment between the CPC and the Affordable Housing Trust. So that could be something that you could consider if that may help with communication between the boards. We just always kind of caution about not wanting too many people on too many boards on your boards. because you want to be able to receive a quorum, get to a quorum, but having that kind of liaison between the boards can be helpful. And then establish early on between your boards, particularly the Housing Trust and the CPC, a method or a time limit, how often you want reporting back between the entities. In some communities, they might do joint meetings. They might have the trust come to a CPC meeting periodically. They might also include select board members. When the trust is funding different projects or developments, promote those, make it known that that's what the trust is behind, that's what the trust is supporting. And an easy way to do that is using a web page where you're including information about who's on the trust, links to your bylaw, contact information if you have a staff person that's supporting your trust, a list of your guidelines or your goals if you have that, a link to your housing production plan or your needs analysis. Like, have a space, and many of you do, but have a space where it's easy for someone to get a lot of this information so that there's clarity, they can understand what the trust is involved in. And then, something that we see a lot, and I'm sure that you see it in different ways in your community, but many of us are pretty competitive people, and I am one of those people, but try to stay focused on the end goal of increasing the supply of affordable housing in our communities, of responding to the needs of low and moderate income renters and homeowners, and try to stay focused on, try to complement each other to really stay focused on those end goals. Of course, sometimes personalities are challenging, but just try to really stay focused on the bigger goal, and how can our different boards really complement each other to move affordable housing forward. And then a great way that different boards can work together is to really be advocating for affordable housing and helping to create a culture of support in the community. This is just one resource that many of you likely have heard of before. You can just Google, you don't have to live here, but this is just one entity that a couple groups, Enterprise and a social anthropologist, they tested different housing messages in the market to see how people responded to things, because oftentimes affordable housing people and the way that we talk about housing and the need for housing, oftentimes those messages backfire. So it's a very simple read, and it can just give some ideas about how you can be talking about housing in your community. So if your different housing entities as well as the CPC can kind of get on board with some of the messaging so that you're saying similar kinds of things in a similar kind of way, then it reaches more people in the community, and it can begin to start creating this culture of support. So kind of, I don't know if you want to, Andrea, if you want to break now, if anyone has any comments or questions at this point, or other suggestions of working together.
I don't see anything in the chat yet. Does anyone have anything they want to say? Looks like we're good.
Or should we just move on?
Yeah, let's move on. Can you hear me?
Okay, now I can, yeah.
Okay, yeah, and I don't see any hands or questions in the chat, so I think we can move on.
Okay. Oops. Okay, and then with CPA funding housing trusts, so I'm going to go back to this slide, that there are different models that, yes, CPA can absolutely fund housing trusts, and different communities have a little bit different way of doing that. Some require the housing trust to apply for a specific program or a project just like any other applicant. This is, it's the most restrictive for a housing trust. It means that the trust has to know exactly what they're doing and follow through with that specific program or project. The way that the trust statute is written, it does allow the trust, if there's funding in their account, to be more nimble in the market. So if a trust wants to help engage in either themselves acquiring sites for affordable housing, or if they want to be able to support a developer in doing that, and they want to be able to do that quickly and not have to wait for town meeting like the CPC requires in a town, then the trust needs to have some money in their account that's just sitting there. So in this, the second model is that there are communities that allow the trust to apply for funds to have them for this purpose, to be flexible. You know, we do have communities that where the CPC is concerned about what does that mean if we just transfer $400,000, how long does it sit there? What might it be used for? And maybe it feels too vague. So there are definitely ways to kind of mitigate some of that. But it is helpful for a trust to have some funds where they can move nimbly. And then the last is the transfer the set amount each year. So there are communities that do this, and most communities outside of Somerville and Cambridge don't transfer more than about 10% in a given year like that. But these are different models. So because there's oftentimes concerns with the CPC around just transferring funds for no specific purpose necessarily, there are some suggestions that MHP has been giving to affordable housing trusts that I just want to go through a little bit. So one is that we really encourage housing trusts to, one, to be working with current housing data. What are the housing needs in your community, and making sure that that data is relatively current, like within 3 years, no more than 5 years old. And that the trust really be digging in and understanding the identified needs in the community, and then really setting priorities. The housing needs in our communities are very great. And this is one board, it's a volunteer board, you have limited resources. So what are the key needs that you're interested in addressing, and really identifying those? Perhaps creating benchmarks about how much you spend on very low income households, but that's a preference if you want to do that as well. But we are encouraging trusts to take the time to do this kind of planning, to understand your needs and to identify your priorities. And then to do some sort of planning. It could be more simple, like creating guidelines or goals. And this could be done internally without hiring a consultant. It could be more full blown, like what Amherst did on the right, where they hired a consultant and they did a 5-year strategic plan. Communities are doing this in a different way, in different ways, based on kind of the work that you've already done, or just the sense of need among the trustees. But we're encouraging trusts to have some sort of guiding principles, something that is identifying the values and what the trust wants to be funding. And then to be transparent, to make it easy for folks, including the CPC members, to understand who's involved in the trust and what is the trust working on. And then for the trust to also be explicit about your approach. So some trusts want to just review applications and to be a funder. Some want to be more of an initiator. So during this pandemic, we saw many affordable housing trusts actually be the entity in town that spearheaded local emergency rent assistance programs. Some trusts want to be an advocate. So in Medfield, their affordable housing trust is really being vocal and out front about supporting different affordable housing developments, or developments that have affordable housing within the development. So that's a role that they're playing in the community. So we're encouraging trusts to also identify how you're operating and be explicit about that. And we're encouraging these steps on the behalf of the trust, so that there's a little bit less kind of fuzziness for the CPC specifically about what is the trust about, what do they see their role in the community, and what are they intending to spend their funds on. So that when the trust comes and asks for just $300,000 without any, that's just for no specific program, that the CPC can look at the guidelines, look at the work that the trust has done, and have a sense of the kinds of things that the trust is wanting to fund. And a grant agreement can be used to mitigate some of the concerns that a CPC may have in transferring funds without it being for a specific program. So the grant agreement can set deadlines of when they expect the funds to be spent, or be returned to the CPC. So, we definitely have situations where the CPC has transferred funds to the trust, and maybe it was 5 years ago, and there's uncertainty about whether the funds have been spent or when they're going to be spent. These kinds of things can be written in the grant agreement. So if a trust is really interested in funding affordable housing development, you don't want the funds to have to be spent within a year or two. You want to give a window because of how long it can take a developer to bring together all the different funding sources necessary to build affordable housing. But there can be some parameters on this. There can be some expectation around clarifying purposes. While it doesn't have to be as specific as for an emergency rent assistance program, there can be some clarifying of the expectations of how the funds are going to be used. You can include a requirement to report the use of funds in it, so you can remind the trust that they need to be reporting back each year about how they're using the funds. And you can say that you want that report by August 15th or September 1st, so you have enough time to include that information in your CP3 report to the state by September 15th. You can request periodic updates on the Housing Trust work, and you could ask the trust to be explaining their priorities and their goals, and how are they moving forward on those, and what are the roadblocks, and what do they anticipate in the future. So the CPC can be adding this into the grant agreement and expecting there to be a conversation, that you're not just transferring funds and then there's radio silence, but that there's a conversation that's happening between the two entities. We would encourage that, actually. So wanting to switch a little bit now to looking at relationships between entities and how communities are managing those. So I'm just going to give a few thoughts, and then we're going to transfer to Alan and Nancy in Orleans to talk about some of their work and how they're working together. So in communities, when they may have had an affordable housing committee or an affordable housing partnership for several years, and then they're creating an affordable housing trust, we see that in some communities, they decide to keep both entities. The partnership may become more of an advocacy entity, or some partnerships or committees may have had the responsibility to review development applications that include affordable housing in the town. So maybe different Chapter 40B developments. And then that the trust may be more of a funding entity, more of it focused on implementation. So sometimes that's how the roles are distinguished. In some communities, that particularly perhaps smaller communities, they may have a hard time keeping an affordable housing committee or partnership fully filled, and as well as an affordable housing trust. So there have been cases where the trust may absorb the partnership. This happened in Weston as an example. In some communities, they may share trustees across a couple housing entities. So Brookline, their affordable housing trust trustees also sit on their housing advisory board. So they're separate entities, but they're the same trustees, just with different responsibilities. And then in some communities, they may share a paid staff person between the CPC and the Affordable Housing Trust. So this is the model in Chelsea right now, where they have an admin person that is supporting both boards. And so this helps to build a relationship between both boards, and it helps with communication as well. So there are a variety of different models that communities are using to help facilitate collaboration between the Community Preservation Coalition, committee, as well as the Affordable Housing Trust. In Orleans, we've asked Nancy, who is a part of the Affordable Housing Committee, and Alan on the Affordable Housing Trust, to talk a little bit about their experiences. So Nancy is going to start us out and share a bit about the original support that the committee had to establish an affordable housing trust, and some of the challenges that they've experienced in delineating roles between the entities. Alan's going to share a little bit about the Affordable Housing Trust being new and the board developing its role in the community. And then they're both going to share some of the strategies that they've used to communicate and to work on collaborating between the entities. So I'm going to turn it over to Nancy. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Nancy.
Good morning. I just wanted to say that Orleans has been an advocate and facilitator of affordable housing since the 1990s, and the Affordable Housing Committee has been involved with that. It's part of the town's comprehensive plan. It's supported by community preservation grants, town funds, nonprofit funds, and developer investment. CPC has funded housing studies for us, educational outreach, and future housing initiatives, both local and regional in character. 4 years ago, the need to provide more affordable housing had become even clearer than before, but with few parcels of land available and no authorization to act upon real estate, we were finding the way forward very unclear in the Affordable Housing Committee. Fortunately, we were also participating in the housing institutes and learning new ideas at that same time that we were becoming really frustrated. So beginning in 2017, 3 important steps were taken by the Affordable Housing Committee to improve the process. First, with funding from CPC, the committee authorized the community housing study to find out where we were and where we were going. In 2019, working with the select board, the Affordable Housing Trust Board was established with the help of the Affordable Housing Committee. Also, a warrant article for an annual appropriation of $275,000 to the trust was supported by the voters in fiscal year 19, 20, and 21. And then we hope that will be an annual appropriation when asked. Also in 2019, the Affordable Housing Committee worked with the Select Board and MHP to authorize a feasibility study of the Cape Cod 5 property for potential reuse as housing. That was a wish in the sky for us at that point, but as you know, it's becoming a reality. Thus, the process and mechanisms were put in place to be able to act when property and/or land should ever become available in Orleans. And, you know, if you build it, it will come is sort of the attitude. And I think putting these things in place, suddenly we had the will, and now we have the opportunity to actually have some land and some very wonderful, you know, possibilities for affordable housing in our town. So in late 2019, we began to experience how the established Affordable Housing Committee, and I use the word established meaningfully, the established Affordable Housing Committee and the newly formed Affordable Housing Trust Board were going to work together to impact housing choice in Orleans. In retrospect, I compare this process like leaving your new baby with a trusted relative. You know they will take good care of them, but it's really hard to let them go and hand them over. And I think that's where we came to the point where this came up as a discussion with Andrea, you know, moving forward, our commitment as Affordable Housing Committee, their new commitment, how is that going to work together? So I see the absorbing the partnership as a possibility, but that wasn't in our idea. We wanted to stay focused in this group. As the two groups sought to collaborate to decide who would lead or who would follow, who would interface with the CPC, who would advise, all these questions kept coming up, and we were discussing them in our own committees or in joint meetings. So a member from each of our committees developed a document called Guiding Principles. It was approved in October of 2019. It included a history of what's been done, the mission of both groups, the charges of both groups, priorities for housing, strategies we might follow, and roles and responsibilities. This was a good effort on the part of 2 people, and then it was approved by the whole committee, by both committees. And it started the discussion, or it's tried to lead us in a way that we could work together. This vehicle did lead to increased collaboration when we remembered to read it, but it did not address as clearly the distinctions between our 2 committees. Organizing communication has been a work in progress, and we continue to build on this. Alan and I share agendas, discuss strategy, and build upon our ideas. Our new housing coordinator, Marcia, is also a new integral part of the team. That was another thing the Affordable Housing Committee pushed for, and we're really glad to have had that beginning this last fiscal year. So now we have a new bridge between our 2 committees, which connects the town and the Affordable Housing Trust and the Affordable Housing Committee. I think that's enough for now for Alan. Can maybe go on. And I have some other points for the next section.
Okay, Alan, will you share a little bit about how the trust is becoming established and identifying its role in the community?
Sure. I'm sitting here listening and thinking about my own experience here. It just so happened that when the committee came to the select board to talk about recreating our trust, I was chair of the select board. I also happen to be chair of the Community Preservation Committee. And once we decided to go ahead, I made sure that I was appointed to the trust and I was elected chair. So we were sort of pretty well connected at that point, at least for the first 4 months of the trust's existence. Then I decided not to run for re-election. There was a warrant article to add 2 seats to the trust. Town meeting approved that in May 2019, and I got appointed back to the trust in July of 2019. One other little bit of history before I pick up where Nancy left off. Ironically, in the town of Orleans, a housing trust was created before there was a housing committee back in the 1990s. And the town really, I don't think, was thinking much about affordable housing at the time. And a group, a private group, Friends of Affordable Housing, FOA was called, raised private money and helped create for affordable housing units. And that was private money that came in, and the town said, oh my God, how are we going to manage this? And there was a trust created to deal with that issue. Then some people started saying, well, wait a minute, we better have somebody talk about what the trust is supposed to do. And a committee was created. And that's the committee that Nancy has talked about. It's gone through several changes. So Nancy's so correct. We spent all this time in 1919 developing guiding principles, because as we sat around as a trust of 9 and a committee of 7, and we always had a situation where there was at least one member who served on both. Katie Wibby was chair of the housing committee at the time. She was on the trust. So we had this interlocking relationship. But we needed to collectively understand our respective roles and responsibilities. And as Nancy said, a member of the trust and a member of the committee worked hard to put together the guiding principles. And we followed that as best we can. I like to think that the trust, which by the way, is a town agency in the town of Orleans. We've adopted the state statute and we have all the responsibilities allowed in the statute. But when you go through the trust, you determine that it is a town agency. And so all the banking of the trust is handled by the chief financial officer in the town of Orleans. So the reporting back to CPA is a little easier in Orleans because all the numbers are sitting in the town accountant's office anyways. A couple of interesting things. Nancy noted that the committee, which was really out on front of this, had the courage to go to town meeting and ask for a general override for $275,000. And as chair of the Board of Selectmen at that time, we had a unanimous vote supporting that. That isn't a lot of money, but because it is a fixed annual appropriation, it can be leveraged. And the trust then went out and accepted bids for a line of credit. And we now have a $2 million line of credit that we can use with the Cape Cod 5 for any project that we want. And so if we have a money crunch, we have this line of credit that allows us to go ahead. And we could do that because we had this vote of town meeting guaranteeing $275,000 a year. I think you could do it through CPA if you had an annual commitment in CPA. But if you didn't have an annual commitment, the banks might not want to come forward because they say, well, wait a minute, we don't have a guarantee that you can meet. So the committee has also pushed the CPC for annual appropriation. And we've had 300,000, 500,000, 500,000, and this year we'll have 300,000. So the CPC has been on board, and it results in the trust having money and assets of about $2 million. We own a condominium unit and some other things, but we also have cash resources of a little over $1.1 million. One of the critical things that I want to mention about creating the trust in Orleans, and I was on the select board at the time, and I felt very strongly about this. We wanted to make sure that key decisions that the trust could take under the statute also required select board approval. This was important to me because I spent my life working for urban renewal authorities, which are independent organizations, and periodically in communities, they leave the reservation. I wanted to make sure in Orleans that the trust, which had financial resources and could buy and sell property, had to work with the select board to get the final approval. Not town meeting approval, but select board approval, which has resulted in a very strong working relationship between the select board, the trust, and the committee. And I would just mention that right now, as some of you know, the town has a warrant article to try and acquire the Governor Prince Motel. We're seeking $2.8 million to do that. I will tell you that all the discussions leading to this decision were in executive session with the Housing Committee, the Housing Trust, and the Select Board all present. So there were 20 plus people there. And so you could see that there was a great interrelationship between all the parties. And just closing, one other thing that we've done as of last Thursday, we have agreed to contribute $2 million to the Cape Cod 5 project, which Nancy noted started with work of the committee. And this will help Penrose Development purchase the land from the Cape Cod 5. And we decided that we would go to CPC and ask for that $2 million. Penrose actually went directly, the committee and the trust supported them. And what we would do is we would bond that $2 million. Now, I believe this is one of the first times in Massachusetts that a CPC has bonded affordable housing. And we spent a lot of time with bond counsel in Boston, local lawyer here, and local lawyer for Penrose. And last week on Thursday, before the warrant went to press, there were emails back and forth every 2 or 3 minutes trying to put this together. But we are convinced that this is a legal way to approach. And what will happen is the town meeting will, on the recommendation of the CPC, vote to bond $2 million for the Penrose project at Cape Cod 5. And in return, we will acquire an affordable housing deed restriction. And we have shown that the value of that restriction is greater than $2 million. So that gets us over that hurdle. So what will happen in the future is that every year, this is $2 million over 20. So let's say at today's interest rates, $110,000 a year, the CPC will have a fixed cost of $110,000 out of its 10% housing requirement. And in the town of Orleans, Stuart, thank you, with the 30 plus money that percent we're going to be getting, we get about $1.3 million to $1.4 million. So we must spend a certain amount on affordable housing anyways, and the 110 is going to be less than what we have to spend. We're going to get $330,000 in state money. So in fact, what's happening is our commitment to Cape Cod 5 is not costing the town of Orleans anything, because the state match on the CPC is more than what we're going to be paying off on the bond issue. So when you think about selling something to town meeting, we are getting 62 units of affordable and workforce housing at no cost to the town of Orleans. And this all came together because of the committee and the trust and the select board working as one to deal with one issue, which is affordable housing. So that, I think I'll stop with that. This banker will leave and we'll open it to any questions when they come up. Thank you very much.
That was fantastic. And Alan did start getting into some of the strategies between boards. I'm going to let Stuart talk about how many communities, or an idea of how many communities have bonded for community housing, because there are several CPCs that have bonded to support affordable housing, but it's fantastic to hear that Orleans is moving in that direction as well. So I wanted to ask Nancy, if you said you had a few things that you wanted to bring up to talk about kind of strategies between boards and how you're helping to support communication specifically between the Affordable Housing Committee and the trust. But if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Well, you talked about the need to have the similar message throughout all the boards and groups that are talking about this, and that's our real challenge right now, is trying to get the story out and have the message. I've been, because of all this, we're working on everything, I've been listening to a lot of meetings, and I hear a lot of need for clarification, even on things that we thought we have actually expressed and explained. Need to re-clarify and get everybody on the same page. And so I heard this more often than not, that our role has suddenly become an advocacy role, and I'm all for advocacy, but I feel that in order for us to be really strong, we have to understand the process. We have to understand the project. We have to be part of that initiation discussion, as well as, we don't have to do all of it, but we have to know what's going on, because for the integrity of the group for advocating, I do believe that you have to understand what the trust is doing, what the CPC is doing, and then get that story out. It can't just be affordable housing is good for us all, because we know that's not enough. So I think we're trying to really work hard with, as Alan mentioned, the select board, the citizens forum in our town, the different town committees, going to the finance committee, really trying to explain this over and over again, and so they will have faith in our projects and understand where this money is going. It is not an easy job, but I think it's a very valuable job. And I think the more we work together, the trust, and hearing also the CPC, I think our influence today was mostly our two groups, but I see the need for even going further with the CPC as well. So, in continuing their support of us. So.
Fantastic. Clearly, let's acknowledge that you all are volunteers, and it's a lot of work. Communication across boards, particularly when we're doing so much virtually these days, it is a heavy lift. It is a lot of work, and it takes time. It's not something that just happens quickly or once. It's a conversation and a relationship. Alan, do you have anything else that you would like to add before we move on?
I'll pass at this point and be ready for any questions, comment later.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to the two of you. It's nice to hear all the work, the progress that's happening in Orleans in really a relatively short period of time. So we're going to switch to community or regional collaboration. And we are very happy to see that on the Lower Cape that you are really trying to collaborate beyond just your community. It's an example that we use across the state, actually, and we really appreciate the work that CDP has put into establishing a platform and space for you to be working together and to support that. As far as I know, it's the only part of the state where some communities, CPCs, are funding housing development across the border into other communities. And that is something that is wonderful and really neat to see. And we talk about that around the state. I've asked Stuart from the Community Preservation Coalition to spend some time talking with us about this, about suggestions from him, implications about your use of CPA funds and funding affordable housing. So I'm going to turn it over to Stuart and just let him take it.
Great. Thanks, Shelley. So first, did you want me to quickly just, you didn't put me on the spot there too much, but I did quickly go to the database and look up the bonding information. So
yes, I think, yes.
I was like, oh my Lord, I better go quick and look this up because I don't know off the hand, but Alan is right. It's pretty rare for communities to to bond for housing. And so it's only happened 26 times in the history of CPA for about $36 million. And most of them have been projects on municipal land, to acquire land for housing or to help the housing authority build more units on their land. What Alan has created there and the program that's being done for the Cape Cod project is really unique because it's really a separate entity from the town that the bond is going to support. So, Alan, I think you just talked yourself into writing an article for the Community Preservation Coalition website on how to do that, because it is pretty unique. And we'll expect that by the end of the month. Is that good enough, Alan? Does that sound good?
I'll put something together, provided town meeting votes it, Stuart. May 22nd.
All right, good. So in talking about regional projects, I laughed when Shelley asked me to do that, because I said, actually, the folks who are going to be on this call today should be the ones teaching us about how to do regional projects, because as Shelley mentioned, this is just not something that happens a lot around the state. But it is important because the CPA legislation had an amendment in 2012 that encouraged community preservation committees to consider and plan for regional projects. It was part of a very large piece of legislation that made a bunch of changes to CPA. But the League of Women Voters actually engaged with us when that legislation was moving through the process and really wanted this regional issue brought to the front by being included right in the CPA legislation. And we thought it was a great idea and worked with them on some language. So in the planning part of the CPA legislation, where it talks about the planning that a CPC needs to do, it says they need to consider regional projects. So we'll talk about it in a second as to how we can maybe coax more CPCs around the state to do that. We do see regional projects around the state, but usually they're in the recreation or open space category. We have a lot of regional school districts that get together to build recreational assets that are then shared among all the communities in the regional school district. We occasionally see communities that have open space, a very large piece of open space that spans multiple communities, bond together to protect that land, either through purchasing or more commonly a conservation restriction. But the Cape and Islands really are the places where we see this regionalization happening in housing. Not just the Cape, the islands too, because the Island Housing Trust has really done a terrific job of bringing all the communities together on the vineyard to support housing. Liz Rust, I hope, can give us a little perspective on if that sort of thing is happening in her region, in the Metro West area, northwest of Boston, when she talks in a second. But it's really not very common elsewhere. So why is that? Why has the success happened more on the Cape? And what are some of the things that are unique to you that you can build on to make it happen even more? Well, first, there's obviously much more cohesiveness among the communities on the Cape and Islands. I mean, there just aren't many communities in the state that even have a regional name that is so well known. What's the region called just west of Boston? It doesn't really have a name that is stuck. But the Cape is the Cape, and people think of it really as one entity in many respects, and same for the vineyard. So there is a much more cohesiveness and a much more opportunity for towns to have a regional feel to their existence. The other thing we see on the Cape that is really different than the rest of the state is, a really willingness that they're all in this together and they really want to help these projects happen. Other parts of the state are much more focused on the subsidized housing inventory, reaching that 10% goal that the state says you have to have among your housing units. So we see a much more parochial, look at the view of things around the rest of the state, where they're like, why should we put money into a regional project? We won't get credit on our subsidized housing inventory. Only the community where the housing is actually constructed gets credit from the state on their subsidized housing inventory. That's something we need to change in the 40B legislation. I know it's been tried in the past without much success, and it's certainly something that we should urge the state to look at, to give regional credit for housing. But there's less concern about that on the Cape. The Cape seems to really understand that the goal here is to build housing, and whether it's 2 miles down the road or right in our town center, it's still helping the whole region. And the other reason, frankly, I think we're seeing more regionalization is the Cape generates a ton of CPA money. Some of the numbers that are talked about, even in the smaller communities on the Cape, are in the millions in terms of CPA revenue. And it's just not that way around the state. That's really an anomaly. And there's a reason for that. First of all, the property values are incredibly high on the Cape and Islands, and the CPA is based on the property values. So you're going to generate a lot more income that way. And then the other thing is every community on the Cape and Islands and Nantucket all adopted CPA at the full 3% surcharge. And that has to do with merging the Cape Cod Land Bank into CPA. It's a complicated history, but the bottom line is you have 3%, and most Cape communities have no exemptions. They're not exempting low-income people from the surcharge. They're not exempting the first 100,000 of home value, and the rest of the state is primarily doing that. So if you look at the CPA revenue and rank the top communities, the Cape and Islands communities are all at the very top of CPA funding around the state, which means you're also pulling a tremendous share of money out of the trust fund as well. So there's a lot more money to be able to be used on projects on the Cape. And I think CPA communities there feel, and you should remind them of that there's a lot of money in there. So they feel like they can spend some of it regionally because there's plenty more to spend in their actual community. So those are some of the things that we see that make the Cape a little bit unique in terms of the regionalization. Some of the keys to success, I think, for trying to do more regional projects, the specialty housing seems to really resonate with people. A house for veterans, autistic children. Up in Rockport, this wasn't a regional project, but it does serve the region. They had a project that for folks with traumatic brain injuries, and Lexington did the same thing, which obviously serves people from beyond the borders of that town. So that really has a tremendous appeal more regionally than other types of housing, particularly. And Shelley talked a lot about this. Another key to success is really setting the table early. And Shelley talked a lot about that. But one thing that I'd add to what she said is you want to make sure that your CPC includes regional projects and the desire for regional projects in their community preservation plan. Every CPC is required to do a plan, and they're required to update that plan every year. And I'll bet you there aren't many at all that have as a priority in the housing category to look at regional projects. So the more you can get in front of your CPC during their planning time and go to their public hearing, they're required to have a public hearing every year, and really push them hard to include regional projects in their plan, then it's much easier when you come with a regional project, if it's in the plan already among the CPA communities, that they are prioritizing those types of projects. So you want to meet with the CPC about this. Don't wait until you have a project and you're asking for money. Meet with them earlier and express the importance of putting it in the plan. The other thing I think is a key to success is, as Shelley said, you're all volunteers, and you should not try to do a regional project alone. You really need those regional partners, whether it be the non-governmental organization that are out there, the community development corporations, of which you have such great support on the Cape. Those are the ones that can really make regional projects sing. It's going to be very tough for a housing trust member in Orleans to go sit in front of the CPC in Barnstable to talk about that. It's much easier for these regional organizations to do that. So you want to partner with them on that. The other thing is to really target what you're asking for in terms of funding. For what is that funding going to be spent? It is really difficult because of the structure of CPA for a community to fund an acquisition of land in another community. There's a requirement that if a CPA community puts money into an acquisition of land, they have to have some real property interest in that land. They either have to own the land or they have to own the restriction on the land. And so that makes it very tricky for communities to fund acquisition in other communities. So what you really want to focus on in terms of the ask on regional projects is the feasibility work, the engineering, the studies, the design work, the construction work, the legal work. Those are the things that are much easier to fund than actual land purchase requests. The key to success, I think, is involving your legislators. You know, they have an ability to get earmarks from state money into projects. It's not an easy thing, but it's impossible if they don't know about these projects. And they can spread the word, and, you know, they can support you by coming to, you know, ribbon cuttings and things like that. And they always bring the press along. And they have tremendous the legislators have tremendous social media followers and accounts and websites, and they're traveling all over talking to communities. So really get together with your legislators and have them understand what you're looking to do. And of course, legislators represent a region, right? So they're a perfect conduit, you know, to multiple communities. If you want, you know, Orleans to find out about something, well, go to their state rep. Because they're working with Orleans, and you might, in another community, might not necessarily be working so closely with Orleans. It goes without saying that you're going to have to focus on what the need is and not the getting credit on the subsidized housing inventory. Because if you're in one community and you're asking another community to help fund a project, you're not going to be able to promise them that they're going to get credit on the SHI. Only the community where the housing is built is going to get that credit. So you really need to focus on the need rather than the SHI, obviously. And while we're on the subject of counting units, Shelley did mention the official state CPA database, which all communities are required to report all their expenditures of money by September 15th every year. And one issue we do see in that database on regional projects is that everyone claims the units. So we see double counting of units. So if 4 communities, you know, all contribute to a project that's going to generate 20 units, they each put 20 units in their project database. And all of a sudden, you know, we have more affordable housing units on the Cape, you know, on paper than we have people on the Cape. So it's important that only the community where the housing is actually going to sit, you know, put the units in their what's called the CP3 database, or the state's project database. So the last thing I'll say is let us know about your regional successes. You know, with only a few of them happening around the state, you know, we don't have a lot of examples to spread around the state. And we really want to promote this concept and promote your success that you've had on the Cape and Islands in doing it. So, you know, email us, call us. We have tremendous number of followers across the state on our social media and our website and our newsletter. We're really looking to push the envelope on this regional project idea, especially since it's now in the CPA legislation. So please let us know everything that that you're doing on that. And as Alan did say, it is a great time to be, you know, asking for more money for housing, because just yesterday, the Department of Revenue announced the projection on the state funding match from the trust fund. Every November 15th, money is distributed from the CPA trust fund from the state to all CPA communities. And for the first time in a very long time, the match is going to break through 30%. The first round match is projected next fall at 32.3%, which is really a terrific return. And all the Cape and Island communities will get more than that, because that's just the first round match. And communities that adopted CPA at the full 3% surcharge get more than that. So that's the minimum that Cape communities will receive. You know, it's a great time to be asking for these projects and more funding. The last thing I'll quickly talk about is there is one piece of legislation that's pending on CPA and the housing issue. It doesn't have to do with regionalization, but it does have to do with folks who are acquiring affordable housing. And so I just tell you all about it in case you stumble across one of your state legislators and they ask about this CPA legislation. Every time an affordable house is purchased by an affordable home buyer, they obviously have a mortgage. But unlike most of us, which only have a primary mortgage, If you buy an affordable home, you very often have second mortgages and maybe third and maybe even fourth. You know, Shelley talked about the funding programs that Mass Housing has, and MHP has, and individual towns sometimes, the big cities have housing programs. And so CPA's trust fund generates revenue by fees that are collected at the Registry of Deeds. So when an affordable home buyer goes to file their first, second, third mortgage, they're paying those fees 3 times. And obviously that's, you know, the very people who you don't want to be paying large fees when they're buying affordable homes. So there is a piece of legislation pending that would exempt people who have second and third and fourth mortgages from paying those CPA fees at the registry. Yes, it's going to reduce, you know, the revenue into the trust fund, but it's going to be a tiny amount, you know, thousands over the course of a year, and the trust fund generates about 75 million in revenue. So the impact will be very, very slight, but it will really help the people who CPA was designed to help, the people who are trying to buy and construct affordable housing. So with that, I'll turn it back to you.
So I don't know if Andrea, if you want, or Belinda, if you want to facilitate questions, or if you want me to. It looks like we have a few questions.
Up to you. What do you prefer?
Okay, well, Florence has had her hand up. So Florence, do you have a question for Stuart? Maybe she stepped away. So Donna did bring up a couple questions in the chat for Stuart. So Stuart, is there a model to have a regional CPA committee?
That's a great question. Is a model, but I don't know if it's very successful. The Vineyard has tried to unofficially create a entity where all the CPCs get together on a regular basis. They've had some success with that, but there's no legal entity that supports that. So I don't think they've had as much success as they've wanted to. So I think the best way we have regions collaborate is, you know, like Liz Rust is going to talk about in a minute, these regional housing organizations, I think, are even a better way for communities to get together formally.
And then Donna's asking about when there's a regional project, should every town be on the deed restriction? And I don't think that that's possible, but I don't think that Stuart or I probably have the answer to that. That you'd probably need to bring your town council in to talk through that. Is Florence back? Where is she?
Yeah, no, I don't know why my hand is up. I didn't have a question. I can't seem to get it down. Sorry, Shelley. But
Okay.
while I have it,
There you go. There you go. Okay.
Here, a quick question. For how long has this CP3 report been in existence? Is that a recent requirement, or has that been for many years?
So the reporting of CPA projects to the state began in 2007. Up until that time, actually, our organization collected all the CPA project data, but we're not a state agency, and we really shouldn't have been the ones collecting it. And it became, as the number of communities and the number of projects rose, it became really a really overwhelming thing to do. So we worked with the state in 2007, and they developed an entire system where they now collect the data, and communities are required to report that data by September 15th every year. Usually it's the Community Preservation Committee that does it. Sometimes it's folks inside Town Hall. The thing that's newer is the requirement that housing trusts report all their activity with CPA funds back to the CPC. That came around maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, when there were some amendments made to the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust legislation. And part of the amendments were the requirement that housing trusts do need to send a report every year detailing exactly what they've spent their CPA funds on. And Shelley's organization came up with this great reporting form that a lot of folks use. It's important because of the way money is often transferred to a trust. It's not transferred in some cases for a specific purpose. and it's public money. So there really has to be an accounting of exactly how the trust, if there's not going to be an accounting going out where the money is transferred, there really has to be an accounting when the money is then spent. So that's the reason the amendment was made to the municipal affordable housing legislation, as we saw, the state saw a large number of funds going to housing trusts, and those were CPA funds, but yet they weren't getting reported in the project database because the CPC and the town sometimes didn't know exactly how those funds were spent. So this is an opportunity for the public accounting of that to go into the CPA database. So that is fairly new, Florence.
Thank you.
So we're going to shift, looking at the time, we're at 11:14. Liz Rust has told me that she has joined the call. So we're going to shift and ask Liz to share a bit about the Housing Services Office that she helped establish in the greater kind of Concord, Sudbury area, and that she's been a part of for several years. So just as another model of how communities are working collaboratively in different regions to support affordable housing. So Liz?
Yes, hi everybody. I'm really glad to be here. I'm actually on Cape Cod here on this kind of cold, rainy day. So I'm here to talk about the Regional Housing Services Office, which is one example of a shared housing services office organization. So I know that's a lot of housing organization terms. And MHP had a very comprehensive workshop session yesterday on 5 different models. And CDP was featured in the showcase, as well as the RHSO and a number of other organizations. I'm going to do a quick share screen, which I think I can do here. And we're going to share like that. And that's really, can you see that? Yep, thank you. So this is the RHSO service model, and I'm just going to talk about this just in a few minutes. As again, one example. And we use the term RHSO or Shared Housing Services Office to talk about municipalities that have grouped together through an intermunicipal agreement. And that's what makes this a different and specific kind of model, that these, in this particular case, it's these 9 communities have partnered together as municipalities. So they are signing on as their town administrators, their town managers, and their leadership, their board of selectmen and select boards and whatever the appointed and elected leadership. So it's not a consulting, it's not a shared consultant, which everyone could procure separately, but this is an intermunicipal agreement. And again, it is the partnership between the communities that establishes how the entity is organized.
Liz, I'm sorry to interrupt, but can you make it your full screen? Hit the green button, see if you can make that bigger a little bit.
I can try to do that. Why don't I just try to do it this way?
Next.
How about that? Is that a little bit better?
Thank you.
The member towns receive these benefits for an annual fee in this particular model. Now, these parameters can change based on the different models that you might come up with. This is a 3-year term. It's renewed annually, so it's proactively signed on from the municipal leadership. It's a specific number of contracted hours, and that facilitates the level of service as well as the staffing, so that the staff, you be sure that across 9 communities that you have enough staff on board to support them. There's in terms of oversight, there's an advisory committee, and then there's some shared costs. The lead community covers all of the staffing and contracting. That's their biggest job. So in some ways, this model is a procurement model. The organization, the member communities don't need to follow any 30B practice or process to get staffing assistance. They sign on to the IMA, and the town of Concord provides the service. And the town of Concord, in this case, is responsible for RFPs, for hiring staff, for doing whatever is required for all that contracting. And in this case, you can see the number of units and various pieces here. Yeah, so I was just going to sort of stop there. I know that, you really are ending at 11:30, so I don't want to spend much more. Oh, I see now in the chat. Can you zoom in a bit? Hopefully I've done that for you. But this is just one example, and I know that you have, choices as interested communities of how to collaborate together towards your common housing goals. So the shared IMA is just one example, but again, it's the municipal partnership that sets it apart from other models. And so it's something that the communities are doing together. And then the services that we provide as staff to that office are cross sort of regional. We do some trainings, we do some sessions, but a lot of it is one-on-one to the particular municipalities. In some ways, they might feel that they've just hired a housing consultant, and they get the services. Now there are 4 housing consultants in our organization. We all work part-time and have different specialties, but they can tap into our office. So maybe I'll just sort of stop there. Is that enough? I don't want to take up. Shelley just wanted me to pop in, say a few words.
So Liz, I would actually ask if you have a few kind of tips on if the communities on the Lower Cape wanted to consider this kind of model. Are there certain things that you might suggest or questions that they should be answering as they're considering different models?
Well, so I know MHP has done some work recently, and MAPC also on how to establish models. What are some considerations here? So there are further resources. Because it's an IMA with some number of terms, it's a commitment to, as a municipality, that you want to sign up with your other partner municipalities. And I think that's really, I've stressed that here because I think that's really the biggest opportunity for your communities together. I know that you've looked at this, and I've presented, I think, to some number of you over the past. So I know that this is not a new topic in terms of consideration or how to move forward together. So
we have a few questions specifically for you.
Sure.
Do you provide resident services?
Yes. So one of the things that we do provide is a central email and phone number. So if current residents or even future residents want to call and ask about where can I get housing, or I'm having a problem with the housing that I have, we do provide that service. I didn't really go into the things that we do, but we do proactive monitoring and oversight. So that would be for ownership units as well as some of the rental units. We provide central resident support. We have a website, which is rhsohousing.org, which has some resident services. Some of them are referral based, like fuel assistance and I don't know, other fair housing or legal assistance. And some are if you wanted to resell your unit, if you wanted to refinance on the ownership perspective, or you just wanted to call and have another kind of situation. Does
the lead municipality change every few years?
No, we haven't done that, mostly because, IT wise, we're really locked into, or it's just much easier to stay with one provider for IT, like all of our data and the servers and the backup and the email accounts and the phone numbers and all of that. We also have an office so that people are used to coming to our office back when people used to go to offices. And we did change from Sudbury. So this model's been in operation for just over a decade. And it started based in Sudbury and it's moved to Concord. So we understand exactly how you could move, and we could do some of that, but there's no need to, per se. It's really pretty central, and Concord is pleased to have us to host us, and they receive an administrative fee for those services. The funding is set up in an enterprise account, which is established, a revolving account, excuse me, that is established through town meeting. So it is tied to a particular municipality's books. And again, that is this particular model. You can have other regional models where the funds are received, you know, in a separate 501c3 organizations accounts, but the IMA model has a lead community, and so it's their accounting that's being used for all the funding pieces. And we're
Fantastic.
able to share best practices between the communities, which is another key piece of that, and to have common meetings between the, you know, the planning staff. We are in many ways staff augmentation to the organizations in town, the planning and the whatever groups are looking after housing, and managing the SHI and the inventory, and just keeping up to date on all things, as well as providing support and expertise reviewing development projects, new development projects. And we administer emergency rental assistance programs. We have one program that 5 communities are participating with, though they're each funding separately. So they have their own set of funds, but it's a common program. And we administer home funds. I don't know if that's a program that's used in the Lower Cape. And we also administer small grant programs. So again, we're able to develop a common program and work with a legal counsel to get the right documents, and then leverage that across the towns. So it's not, you know, you're not reinventing the wheel for something that other communities have done.
Fantastic. Thank you. Andrea?
Shelley? Yeah, I just wanted to note that there were a couple questions earlier on when you were speaking. And one of them was a comment that it's really important to engage a CPC when you're developing your housing production plan. And I would just add to that, you know, when you're developing your action plan, or like the strategic plan example that you provided for Amherst. And I think if you take one thing away from this entire training, right, it's that the trust needs to be working really closely with the CPC in order to get the best outcomes around housing production. And the more that both groups are at the table buying into these concepts at the same time, the more likely you are to have those more positive outcomes. Another question that came up was, are there succinct talking points for explaining or selling the CPA bonding to townspeople?
Stuart, are you still there? Do you want to jump in on that?
I am, but I'm going to defer to Alan on that because he's the one who's actually done it before. Alan, you willing to?
Sure.
Maybe there will be after this.
Andrea will learn, okay, the next month. And Nancy and the committee have been talking about this, and they've been putting together the communications package. My thought comes from my experience originally on the Cape Cod Land Bank and then CPC. And the whole strategy in Orleans on the land bank was, we have a window of 20 years, 1999 to 2020. That was the life of the land bank. And if we're going to buy land, let's buy it all as quickly as we can, and let's bond it. And we knew how much money we were going to have, so how much we could carry. And ultimately we had, I don't know, over $9 million of in debt when the CPC was created in 2006. And we've been paying that off. It's all land bank debt, not housing debt. So as I looked at the CPC budget, I said, you know, why can't we use the same technique on affordable housing? And for me, the sales pitch was, we have existing bonded indebtedness and we're paying it off on a regular basis. In fact, when CPC, the Cape Cod CPC started in Orleans in 2006, every single penny of local money was going to bonded indebtedness. And the only new money we had was 100% match from the state. It was a rather fascinating situation. Now, you know, we've got $300,000 on $1.3 million. So the sales pitch that I think is important from a financial side is part of what I talked about already. We need to spend in Orleans' case, $130,000 to meet our 10% affordable housing commitment every year. And if we're going to get 62 units of housing that we've worked on for the last 2.5 years with Cape Cod 5 and now Penrose, doesn't it make sense to obligate 80% of our commitment for affordable housing to this project today so we get it as soon as possible? And then the other thing that I mentioned earlier is the sales pitch is, hey, we're getting $330,000 plus or minus from the state. Let's stand up and say, this isn't really costing us anything. CPC is a surtax. People have voted it. They don't want to get rid of it. The state's share of 330, we're using 10%, we're using 1/3 of that to pay for this housing. That's a hell of a deal. You're getting 62 units of housing at no cost to the town of Orleans. And there are many other things that Nancy and the committee are working on. They've developed flyers and mailers and stuff like that are far more sophisticated. But I think on the town meeting floor, when you can stand up and say, you're getting X and it really isn't costing you any new money. And by the way, because you have CPC, you've got state money coming in, this is a no-brainer. And I think with a combination of the work of the committee and the outreach committee, Andrea's involved in that as well, we've got a sales pitch that will make a difference. The one thing that we're concerned about is that we're asking for a 2/3 vote for a $2 million bond issue. We have to get that. And if we don't, this whole deal falls apart. But as of last Thursday, we have another big project on the warrant, which is $2.8 million for the acquisition of Governor Prince. Not necessarily for affordable housing, but just to control the land like Tea Time in Eastham to make sure that what happens is consistent with the town. And that requires a 3/4 vote because it wasn't in the capital plan. We're very concerned that we have the Penrose Cape Cod 5 project on the warrant a couple of articles before Governor Prince. And you know, because you've all been to town meeting, it's easy for people to get confused. And when people begin to get confused, you lose things that you think are sure things. So we'll be working really hard over the next 6 weeks to make sure that the message is clear and people understand what they're getting.
Thanks, Alan. Shelley, I just wanted to address that last question in the chat, and I know that it's time for us to go. David, to your question about how to address silos and sharing housing coordinators across towns, that's something that the CDP has been working toward for the last couple of years. Several years ago, we responded to RFPs from the towns of Harwich and Chatham with similar scopes of work that include a lot of the things that Liz mentioned. So SHI monitoring, resident services, staffing, different housing related committees, depending on the preferences of the town. And even though the towns are not explicitly sharing staff, right, the services are being provided by a regional entity that is shared by the towns. And so that allows us to have a bird's eye view of what the needs and the trends are in the region. It also allows us to replicate tools to not reinvent the wheel. So, you know, as it makes sense moving forward, we will try to expand more into the RHSO model as that makes sense. We did recently take on Wellfleet, and different towns have different priorities, but I think there's a lot of value in, you know, sort of economies of scale and having that bird's eye view. So I think it all kind of boils down to building trust and relationship building between towns. So the quarterly peer group meetings that we offer on a sub-regional basis are really the only opportunity that I'm aware of where towns get to start building that trust, and that trust, you know, grows into more formal efforts moving forward.
Can I just quickly, I had a question just to me that was a private question that I just wanted to touch on, that it was asking about how do we help our CPCs be accountable for supporting the work of the Affordable Housing Trust and help the CPC to be accountable to investing in needs that have been identified in the housing production plan, which is interesting because I talked a lot about the trust being accountable to the CPC, but then what about the CPC? I think that that's partly what's makes the relationship between the trust and the CPC really important, that the inviting and including the CPC in updating your housing production plan, making sure that the CPC understands the identified needs in the community and why the trust is focused on certain goals. And I think it also requires the select board, making sure that the select board is also involved and that the select board is buying into and understanding the work of the trust and the goals that the trust has identified to help provide kind of some accountability to the CPC, but also just the relationships that some of you, that Alan and Nancy are talking about, to make sure that the key boards are on the same page and understanding the identified needs and why we're focused on certain goals. But thanks so much.
Thank you, Shelley. Thank you, Alan and Liz and Stuart and Nancy. We will be on our newsletter to learn about future offerings. And thank you so much for being here today. We'll send out the recording as well. Have a great day.